I picked the wedding flowers, I signed the contracts, I paid the bills. But when I arrived, a security guard looked at the guest list and said, "You're not on it." Then my daughter-in-law walked out, stared me dead in the eyes and said, "This was our choice. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong." Subscribe now to catch the next shocking chapters of our story. The morning sun slipped through the blinds, scattering soft gold across the hardwood floors of Grace Lynn's apartment. Dust floated in the beams of light like fragile ghosts, untouched, save for the gentle movement of her hand lifting a porcelain cup of tea. Grace sat at the kitchen table alone, composed as ever, wearing silence like a shawl across her shoulders. Her hair, pinned low at the nape of her neck, shimmered in streaks of silver. Her face, soft but firm, carried the kind of grace only a woman who's endured both devotion and betrayal can wear without trembling. She took a slow sip. The tea had gone lukewarm, but she didn't seem to mind. The clock on the wall ticked, delicate but insistent. She stood. On the back of the bedroom door hung a long navy garment bag. She unzipped it slow and smooth like she was opening the past. The silk dress inside was simple, elegant, the kind of beauty that didn't beg to be noticed, but couldn't be ignored. She laid it out carefully across her bed beside a gift box, wrapped in white paper and tied with a silver ribbon. Her son's wedding gift. She moved to her armoire, opening the doors with deliberate slowness. Inside, her clothes were arranged in rows by season, by color, by purpose. Lavender sachets tucked between hangers breathed a quiet softness into the space. She chose a strand of pearls, not flashy, timeless. As she fastened the necklace, her reflection caught her eye. For a moment, she wasn't the 68-year-old mother preparing for a ceremony. She was the woman she once was. 35, brilliant, brisk, walking through her sunlit floral studio in San Francisco, giving orders with a pencil stuck in her bun. "Grace, the peonies are too tight." "Then blow them open with a hairdryer, gently." She had once designed the flowers for the most exclusive weddings in the Bay Area. Her name had passed between luxury brides like a secret password. But everything changed when David, her husband, died. The scent of flowers became heavy. Arrangements felt like rituals for the dead. Grace closed the studio, buried her ambition, and turned her focus entirely to the one piece of her world still breathing, Ethan, her son, her legacy. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thin, leather-bound sketchbook. Inside were her private notes, rough bouquet sketches, table layout ideas, snippets of pressed petals. She flipped toward the back. Tucked into a page was a delicate anemone, white with a dark center. Its silence seemed to echo louder than any memory. The wedding, Ethan's wedding. A smile touched her lips, brittle at the edges. She had helped pay for the venue part of the flowers, the dress, even the catering, under the assumption that she'd sit with Avery's family, be welcomed into the circle of celebration. "You'll be right beside Avery's mom," Ethan had promised. "You helped make all this possible." She believed him. She always did. She walked back into the bedroom, removed the dress from its hanger, and slipped it on. As she zipped the side, her hands didn't shake. There was still strength in her fingers, still steel in her spine. She pinned a single gardenia to her bun, simple, silent. At 8:45, her phone chimed. The cab had arrived. Grace picked up the gift box, her clutch, and paused at the doorway. The apartment was clean, orderly. A vase of lilies sat on the side table, fresh, fragrant, opening slowly like her own restraint. She stepped outside. The cab driver, a young man with sleepy eyes, greeted her respectfully and opened the door. She nodded once and slipped inside, setting the box gently on her lap. The city blurred by in familiar stroke streets she once walked in heels, arms filled with stems and silk ribbons. Storefronts that used to sell her floral prints. She exhaled through her nose and watched the skyline give way to open hills as they drove toward the coast. The wedding was being held at an estate villa in Half Moon Bay, a sprawling Mediterranean-style venue perched above cliffs and sea spray. Grace had recommended it herself once, back when Avery still smiled with something resembling sincerity, back when Grace still believed inclusion would be given, not earned. The cab turned onto the tree-lined drive. Sculpted hedges, stone fountains, rows of parked cars gleaming like trophies. "We're here, ma'am," the driver said. Grace handed him a generous tip and stepped out, holding the gift box close to her chest. Her heels clicked against the cobbled path as she approached the main entrance. She reached the top step just as the first wave of laughter poured from inside. A young man in a black suit and earpiece intercepted her. "Hi there, ma'am. Can I see your invitation?" She blinked, then offered a small smile. "I'm the groom's mother." The man glanced at his clipboard, flipped a page, flipped back. "I'm sorry you're not listed." Grace's expression didn't shift. There must be a mistake. I was told no exceptions. Before she could speak again, the doors behind him opened and Avery appeared, impeccable in an ivory lace gown, eyes sharp behind her wedding-perfect smile. "Oh, Grace," she said, feigning surprise. "I didn't think you'd come." "Why wouldn't I?" Avery stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on the doorman's arm. "This day is very curated. We didn't want tension." Her voice was soft, pleasant, cutting like polished glass, and loud enough for the gathering guests near the entry to hear. Grace's eyes flicked to the hallway inside, just in time to see Ethan, her son, walking past in a navy tuxedo, eyes forward, avoiding hers. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. The silence that fell between them sliced cleaner than any insult. Grace inhaled slowly, deeply, and smiled. Not the kind that invites. The kind that seals. She nodded once. "I see." She turned on her heel each step down the stone stairs, deliberate, her heels like punctuation against the silence. Behind her, murmurs started. Was that his mother? They didn't let her in. "Film it. Send it to me." Grace reached the bottom step, paused beneath a cherry blossom tree in bloom. The branches shook slightly in the ocean breeze, scattering petals like soft confetti. She didn't cry. Not here. Not now. She walked to the edge of the road where her cab had already pulled away. Around her, cars lined up: BMWs, Teslas, leased Bentleys, all paid for perhaps by the very same quiet generosity they were now pretending never existed. She looked at the wrapped gift in her hands, then turned, walked to the edge of the cliff, and sat on a bench facing the sea. From there she could still hear the music swelling inside the villa, but none of it touched her. She sat still, letting the breeze kiss her cheeks, letting the silence bloom. A whisper left her lips like a vow spoken to the horizon. Today is not the end, it's the beginning. And with that, Grace Lynn, once the queen of flowers, once the architect of joy, closed her eyes and began again. Grace Lynn stood at the edge of the grand estate's stone steps, the chill of the coastal air brushing her skin like a subtle warning. She tightened the shawl across her shoulders. The scent of salt and eucalyptus mingled faintly with something more artificial: floral arrangements, so overdone they reeked of overcompensation. It wasn't the kind of scent she'd ever use in her own weddings. It screamed performance, not intimacy. Ahead, the iron-gilded front doors of the villa stood open, a parade of guests, flowing through like silk ribbons being drawn into a perfect knot. Laughter rippled from within champagne flutes, sparkled under crystal chandeliers, and string quartet music played faintly, as if the entire building was humming a curated lullaby of celebration. Grace took one final step forward. The man at the entrance, a suited event staffer with a clipboard and Bluetooth headset, held up a hand, abrupt but not aggressive. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. His voice was polite, firm, rehearsed. "May I see your invitation?" She blinked. "I'm the groom's mother." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the clipboard. Name, he asked, though he already knew. "Grace Lynn." He scanned the list once, flipped a page, scanned again, flipped back. His brow furrowed, lips pursed. "I'm sorry," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Your name isn't here." Grace's voice remained calm. "There must be a mistake." He tapped his earpiece. "Stand by," he murmured. Then louder, "I was instructed not to allow entry without confirmation. I'm afraid I can't let you through." A low murmur swept the guests near the entrance, a subtle change in pitch like a room collectively holding its breath. Grace didn't turn to look, but she could feel it, eyes tracking her curiosity, sharp and cutting. The scent of judgment thickened in the air. She didn't flinch. From behind the security man, a woman emerged. Avery, poised, radiant, dressed in ivory lace, and carrying herself like a vogue bride with a cause. Her bouquet was oversized, exotic, impractical. Grace spotted the flaws instantly: an unbalanced structure, stems wrapped too tightly, flowers chosen for effect, not longevity. Avery stepped into view like a swan descending from a cloud. "Oh, Grace," she said, her voice feather soft but cool as a blade. "I didn't realize you were arriving this early." Grace looked at her calmly. "I didn't know there was a time restriction." Avery's smile didn't waver. It grew wider, softer, deadlier. "It's just, today is meant to be very intimate. We curated everything intentionally, seating atmosphere, energy." Grace tilted her head slightly. "And I disturbed the energy." Avery took a delicate step forward, just enough to assert control. "We decided it would be less stressful for everyone if the ceremony was kept to a streamlined list. We didn't want distractions." Her voice was low, almost apologetic, but the kind of apology that didn't intend forgiveness. It was performance, scripted empathy. Grace waited. The silence between them grew taut, a string ready to snap. From behind, Avery movement. "Ethan." Grace's heart twitched, not with pain but recognition. He looked thinner than usual. Or maybe the tuxedo just didn't suit him. His hair had been styled within an inch of its life, his tie knotted too tight. He paused when he saw her. Their eyes met. 1 second, 2. Then he looked away. Grace's breath caught, not from shock. She had expected it somehow, but from the cruelty of it being so easy for him. He adjusted his cufflink, smiled at a guest, nodded at a waiter, all while his mother stood outside, denied entry. The guard stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to step back, please." Grace's eyes never left her son. He didn't move, didn't speak. He became smaller with every second he refused to act. Avery placed a manicured hand on the guard's shoulder. "I'll handle it." She turned back to Grace and lowered her voice close enough now to mask her words from the curious guests. "Please understand, this wasn't personal. It's just what's best for us. You know how stressful weddings are." Grace's lips curved faintly. "I do." Avery faltered. "I'm sorry," she said again, and for the first time there was a flicker of discomfort behind her perfect composure. Grace studied her, then nodded once. "Of course." She adjusted her shawl, turned, and walked away. Each step down the stone path was measured even. Her heels made no hurried click, no stumble. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who had designed better weddings than this, who had seen more beauty, more betrayal, more spectacle, and survived it all. Behind her, the whispers resumed. "That's his mother. She wasn't invited. Unbelievable. Film it." Grace reached the base of the stairs, the sound of laughter and violins echoing behind her like a dream she had woken from. The potted hydrangeas lining the entrance, meant to symbolize abundance, looked artificial to her. Too blue, too forced. Everything felt forced. She walked along the circular driveway past luxury sedans and rented limousines, her silk dress whispering against her calves. She reached the edge of the parking lot and stopped. In the distance, the ocean glistened beneath the sun, a mirror of what was true and eternal, unlike the performance she had just left. She didn't cry. There were no tears left in her for this. Instead, she turned slightly and looked back at the villa. She watched a photographer pose a group of guests at the steps. Their smiles rigid, their joy a carefully arranged set piece. Somewhere behind those walls, champagne corks popped and toasts were being raised, and her name, her presence had been erased. Deliberately, she breathed in. The salty air cleared the perfume from her senses. She glanced at the gift still in her hand. The silver bow had come slightly undone. She tucked the end in, smoothed it gently, and whispered something, only 2 words into the silence. "Never again." Then she began walking, not to a taxi, not back to the entrance. She walked toward the road, the long winding road that curved through the hills and led back to the city. She didn't look back, not once, because something had shifted. She had spent her life offering beauty, offering grace. Today she had been offered a lesson, and she intended to remember it. Not for vengeance, but for freedom. Freedom, after all, isn't granted, it's chosen. And today Grace Lynn had made her choice. She would no longer wait for a seat at a table she helped build. She would build her own, in her time, in her name. And no one, not a bride, not a son, not a single orchestrated celebration could unmake that. Not anymore. The lock clicked quietly behind her as Grace Lynn closed the door to her apartment. No gust of wind followed her in. No hurried footsteps. No noise except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of wooden floorboards settling with age. She stood in the entryway for a moment, still wearing her silk dress and pearls, still clutching the wedding gift, like a misplaced offering. The scent of lavender from the linen drawer drifted faintly into the hall. There was no welcome home, just stillness. She placed the gift box on the side table next to a faded family photo, Ethan, at 10, smiling in front of a paper birthday banner she'd hand-painted in bubble letters. His cheeks round his arms flung around a Labrador that had died 2 years later. She reached toward the frame, adjusted it slightly, and let her hand fall. Her heels echoed across the kitchen tiles as she walked to the table and pulled out a chair. The cushions were slightly worn, edges frayed from years of elbows and laughter now silent. She sat shoulders heavy but head high. The dining table was set for one. A bowl of jasmine rice slightly crusted at the edges, braised tofu, a small plate of pickled radish, everything prepared the night before, comfort food kept simple. She unfolded a cloth napkin across her lap and picked up her chopsticks. Outside, the sun began to dip behind the row of townhouses across the street. Inside, light fell across the room in long, sharp beams, casting the shadows of orchids on the walls like elegant ghosts. Grace chewed slowly, not because the food needed savoring, but because speed wasn't required. There was nowhere she had to be, no conversation to keep up with, no need to smile for guests or cameras, no toast to deliver, no role to perform. Across town, champagne corks were being popped. Bridesmaids clinked flutes, guests danced to the rhythm of curated playlists, and Ethan was probably cutting cake, smiling for photos with Avery, his new bride, while pretending the woman who raised him never existed. The distance between them wasn't measured in miles. It was in silence. Grace finished her meal, placed her chopsticks down, and wiped her mouth gently. She stood, carried her bowl to the sink, rinsed it and placed it on the drying rack. Then she turned. Her eyes landed on the filing cabinet tucked beneath the bookshelves in the corner of the living room. A small brass handle glinted in the dusk. She crossed the room and knelt in front of it, pulling open the second drawer. Folders neatly labeled in her elegant script lined the space. She reached for one labeled Ethan and Avery, wedding contracts. It was heavier than she remembered. She carried it to the dining table, laid it flat, and opened the cover. Invoices, emails, service agreements, bank transfers, terms of payment. Her name was everywhere, not just as contributor, as principal client. She flipped through the documents methodically, like a surgeon inspecting the edges of a wound. The venue initial deposit paid by Grace Lynn. Remaining balance due upon final authorization by same. The florist agreement under Grace Lynn's name, 30% paid, 70% pending signature. The caterer, the lighting company, the band, the custom cake designer, the dress alterations boutique. Each contract bore the same structure Grace Lynn as the financial backer, with clauses she'd insisted on long ago. Her estate planner had helped her draft them. "You're generous, Grace," the woman had said, sliding a pen across the contract. "But don't be reckless. Generosity without protection is just surrender." At the time, Grace hadn't thought she'd need it. Now she saw the paper for what it was. Armor. She turned to the final document in the folder, a handwritten checklist. Paid circled in blue ink. Pending circled in red, her own notes in the margins, and at the bottom one sentence written in a moment of quiet reflection weeks ago. "No one can erase what I built unless I let them." Grace stared at the sentence, not with pride, but with clarity. This wasn't just financial. It never had been. This was about presence, about being seen, about erasure. They didn't forget to include her. They excluded her, on purpose, with intention. Grace reached for her reading glasses, slid them on, and leaned forward into the documents as if preparing for a final exam no one thought she'd pass. Her fingers moved steadily from page to page, scanning every line, double-checking every clause. Her heartbeat didn't accelerate. Her breathing remained level. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, the room had grown darker. She didn't turn on the lamp. She let the dusk settle in, as if mourning something quietly. On the wall beside her, framed photos blurred into silhouette Grace and David on their honeymoon in Maui, laughing under a thatched roof. baby Ethan in her arms, wrapped in a hospital blanket, his eyes barely open. She pushed the folder aside, stood, crossed to the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and pulled out a bottle of aged green tea, steeped it in silence. While it brewed, she sat by the window, arms folded across her chest, watching the orange glow of the skyline shift to indigo. There were no tears. She had already cried them in smaller moments, years of compromise, of brushed aside opinions, of unspoken hurt, swallowed so Ethan wouldn't feel guilt. But tonight a new stillness was taking root, not the kind born of shock, the kind born of decision. She poured the tea into a small ceramic cup, one she had made herself in a pottery class, back when she still tried new things. She carried it back to the table and sat down once more, facing the open file. And finally, after one long sip, she whispered into the quiet, "Okay." Her voice was calm, not defeated, prepared. She didn't know exactly what came next, but she knew one thing without hesitation. They thought she would break. Instead, she would build, and this time not for them, for herself. Across town, laughter echoed inside the walls of a villa, draped in imported silk and flickering with overpriced candlelight. Guests raised glasses, oblivious to the woman who had made the illusion possible. But back here, in a modest apartment scented with lavender and lined with contracts, the real celebration had just begun. Not of love, of resolve. Grace Lynn closed the file, and somewhere deep inside her something opened. The sky above Half Moon Bay ignited with light. Gold, crimson, and violet streaks burst into bloom over the Mediterranean-style estate like artificial flowers. The crowd below gasped in rehearsed amazement. Champagne flutes held mid-air iPhones, rising like a field of hands in synchronized applause. A string quartet paused its soft waltz as the DJ cued in the orchestral remix of a love song everyone pretended to recognize. It was perfect. From a distance, the bride, Avery Tran, stood under a cascading arch of imported Phalaenopsis orchids, veil billowing behind her like the ghost of a ballerina. Her gown sparkled under fairy lights draped from olive trees. Its embroidered train sprawled like the root system of entitlement. Her smile, timed with every camera click, gave no hint of disturbance. Her world was curated, filtered, and if only for tonight, secure. Ethan Lynn stood beside her, champagne in hand, gaze locked on a best man giving a half-slurred toast about friendship, fate, and tequila shots in college. He laughed in all the right places, nodded dutifully, but every so often his eyes flicked to the horizon, as if searching for a shape in the dark, or perhaps for a silhouette that didn't arrive. Inside the catering tent, the staff whispered. Someone couldn't locate final clearance for the dessert table. Upstairs, the florist's assistant panicked when the final delivery approval failed to register. Near the back of the venue, a manager stepped out to take a call. Her hand clutched a clipboard. Her voice was tight. "Yes, we submitted payment verification this morning, actually. I understand, but you confirmed the funds were wait. What do you mean, authorization pending? That's not..." She froze. Her eyes flicked toward the main reception, toward the fireworks. Inside the villa, beneath a vaulted ceiling and a chandelier the size of a small car, the general manager of the estate, Reed Walker, stood in his office, staring at his tablet. The payment portal flashed red. Status on hold, authorization required. He tapped the screen again. Same result. He exhaled, tugged at the collar of his crisp black shirt, and dialed a number from the client file. 3 rings. "Hello." The voice on the other end was calm, female, controlled. "Mrs. Grace Lynn." "Yes." "This is Reed Walker, General Manager at Solstice Villa. We're currently hosting the wedding of your son, Mr. Ethan Lynn, and I believe you're listed as the primary financial contact for multiple contracts, including venue services, catering extensions, and late-night entertainment fees." There was a pause. "Yes," Grace said evenly. "I'm calling to confirm final payment release." Reed continued, voice tightening. "Our system flagged the outstanding balance for today's services as pending. Due to an authorization requirement, we were under the impression had already been satisfied." "It hasn't," she said simply. Reed blinked. "I'm sorry. I haven't confirmed final release." "I see. I believe the assumption was..." "I'm aware of what the assumption was." Grace interrupted softly, her voice firm without raising volume. "But as you can see on the contract, my signature is required before full funds are disbursed." "Yes, ma'am, that is correct," Reed admitted. though I imagine this is just a clerical misunderstanding. It's not. The line went quiet. Only the distant crackle of fireworks on the other end bridged the silence. I appreciate you informing me, Grace said. Please note any vendor expecting payment tonight must route final clearance through me directly. No verbal confirmation, no substitutions, written authorization only. I understand, Reed said slowly. One more thing, Grace added. If there are concerns about breach of contract on your end, I suggest your legal counsel reread Clause 4, Section B. She didn't wait for a response. She ended the call. Reed stared at the blinking cursor on his screen for a full 10 seconds before dialing internal operations. Cancel the drone light show, he said. Immediately. Back in Grace's apartment, the silence returned like a trusted companion. She placed the phone back in its cradle, not even wireless, and returned to the binder on the table. Her tea had gone cold. She didn't mind. The moon hung low over the city skyline beyond her window. She stood and walked to the glass, watching lights flicker in apartment buildings like little performances in lives she'd never touch. She wondered if Ethan noticed she wasn't there, if he looked out during the fireworks and scanned the crowd for the absence no one would mention, if he thought of the checks she signed, the hours she spent reviewing contracts while pretending not to overhear Avery snicker about budget-conscious tastes. But more than anything, Grace wondered if he understood what he had done, not the act of erasing her from the guest list. The decision to assume she would still pay for the party she wasn't welcome at, to pretend that love once funded could be dismissed. Back at the venue, whispers stirred behind the scenes. The chef, already preparing for the midnight oyster bar, was told to pause service. The bartender, halfway through shaking a round of lychee martinis, received a message on his earpiece. Put it on ice, came the instruction. No movement until further notice. Avery's mother, Diane Tran, noticed the subtle shift. The head server no longer approached their table. Her husband's request for extra champagne had been met with polite deferral. "What's going on?" she asked Avery between posed smiles. Avery, sensing the shift too, masked her nerves with a laugh. "Probably just a timing issue. We added a lot last minute." Her voice held confidence, but her knuckles were white around the stem of her glass. Ethan caught the look, and for a brief trembling moment the performance cracked. "What's wrong?" he asked her. Nothing, she lied too fast. Then her phone buzzed. She checked it, and the smile died. "Is it your mom?" Ethan asked. "No, it's the florist." She showed him the screen. Payment suspended, pending confirmation from Grace Lynn. He stared at it, read it twice, and for the first time all night he felt something other than momentum. He felt it stop. Grace sat back down at her table, the file folder now closed, resting under her hand like a sleeping animal. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel cruel. She felt balanced, like a scale after years of weight leaning too far one way had finally settled. The screen on her phone lit up again. A new message. From the venue's automated billing system. "You are now in control of all release orders. 2 vendor confirmations are pending, 1 flagged for legal review." She clicked it away. Outside, a neighbor walked their dog. Somewhere above, a plane passed silently overhead. In the villa, music continued, but softer now, like the heartbeat of something that sensed its own fragility. Grace rose from the table, walked to the mirror, and stared at her reflection. She didn't see a villain. She didn't see a martyr. She saw a woman who had finally obeyed her instincts and understood far too late that love without respect is debt. And she was done paying. The call came at 11:42 p.m. Grace Lynn was in her bedroom, seated on the edge of her neatly made bed. A single lamp on the dresser glowed amber against the walls. The city beyond her window had quieted into murmurs, muffled traffic, distant horns, the occasional bark of a dog. Her folder of wedding contracts lay open on the comforter papers, organized in meticulous stacks, corners, aligned like soldiers before inspection. Her reading glasses rested low on her nose. Her fingers moved calmly over documents, rechecking clauses she already knew by heart. But the ritual brought clarity, and clarity was its own form of strength. Then her phone buzzed, the name on the screen, Ethan. She stared at it for 3 full rings. The weight of the name, the sound of it, the memory of calling it out in parks and hallways at piano recitals. The syllables that once meant joy, then hope, then obligation, now hovered with the tremor of disappointment. On the 4th ring she answered. "Hello." There was a pause, 2 beats, 3, and then a voice. "Mom." Just that word, just that name. "Mom, I I know it's late, I'm sorry, but something's wrong. His voice was tight-pitched, higher than usual, and wrapped in a thin veil of forced calm. I've been getting calls. From the florist, from the venue manager. They're saying there are issues with payments, that things are on hold, that your authorization. He stopped. She didn't rush to fill the silence. He exhaled. I thought everything had been covered. Still, she said nothing. Mom, he said again, more desperate now. Can we talk about this? I didn't know there was still stuff pending. I thought Avery's parents, her dad, said it was taken care of. But now everyone's calling me. They say they can't reach you. That's strange, she said quietly. I've had no trouble receiving calls tonight. He flinched even through the phone. She could hear it in his breath. They're saying you haven't signed the final authorizations. That's correct. A beat. A longer one. Okay, he said carefully. Then, can you? I mean, now that the wedding's happened, everything's already been delivered. Everyone's been paid something, right? It's just the last part, the remaining amounts. She closed the folder in her lap, snapped it shut with a soft click. Ethan, her voice was measured, warm, but immovable. I'm still your mother, that hasn't changed. He exhaled, part relief, part bracing for something else. But I am no longer the person who untangles the knots you tied yourself. He said nothing. Outside, a siren wailed distantly, then faded into the night. She continued. You made choices. This wedding, this performance, this erasure. You chose to stand beside a woman who looked me in the eye and turned me away from the ceremony I helped fund. You chose not to say a word in my defense, and now you're surprised that consequences arrived dressed in quiet. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. She waited. He finally whispered, It wasn't meant to be like this. But it is like this. I thought you'd understand. I do, she said. I understand perfectly. The line went quiet again. She imagined him in some corner of the honeymoon suite, tie-loosened shoes off, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed with his phone pressed to his ear and the weight of reality pooling at his feet. Do you know what I did tonight, Ethan? He didn't answer. I sat at the table where you used to eat birthday cake with blue frosting and ask for an extra scoop of ice cream. I drank tea. I sorted invoices. I read legal terms. A soft rustle as she stood and began gathering the papers from the bed. I looked over every contract you asked me to sign, every vendor who now depends on my signature, and I remembered how you asked me so gently to help make the day less stressful. You said it was just support, that Avery's parents were doing so much already, that you just needed me to handle a few things quietly. I didn't mean, but that's just it, she said, cutting him off. You didn't mean to make me invisible. You just assumed I would accept it. He fell silent again. She returned the files to the folder one by one, smooth and methodical. I'm not angry, Ethan. You're not? No, I'm resolved. He made a noise, something between a breath and a broken word. And for what it's worth, she added, I'm not trying to ruin anything. I'm simply declining to validate it. That's different. Mom, please. His voice cracked. She heard it, but she didn't soften. The world you built tonight is yours to maintain. If it can't stand without my blind support, then it was never strong to begin with. People will talk, he said quietly. They already are. They always talk, she replied. It's what people do when they sense a crack in the facade. He was quiet for a long time. Then finally, softly, he said, What happens now? She walked to her desk, opened a drawer, and slid the folder inside. Now, she said, I go to sleep. And tomorrow I decide who I am without the illusion of being needed. He didn't speak again. Grace waited, but the line stayed silent, so she whispered one last thing, Good night, Ethan, and hung up. She stood by the window for a long time, watching as the moon rose higher, casting a silver trail across the rooftops. Somewhere beyond that horizon, her son sat in a luxury hotel, surrounded by the spoils of a wedding that might never be paid for, unraveling a version of his life that had depended entirely on her silence. And she felt a weight leave her chest like an anchor finally cut loose. She sat down at her desk, pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her, and began to write. A list, a plan, not a vengeance, of boundaries. It began with 3 words written in calm, precise script. Do not fold. And as the clock struck midnight, Grace Lynn, mother-widow financier, forgotten guest, picked up her pen and began. The law office smelled like cedar and old books, a scent of order, of boundaries, of things built to last. Grace Lynn stepped inside without hesitation, heels clicking against polished oak. The receptionist stood quickly, recognizing her from a decade ago, though she looked harder now, sharper. "I have an appointment with Mr. Nguyen." "Yes, Ms. Lin, he's expecting you." Min Nguyen appeared in the doorway a moment later, his salt and pepper hair combed back his tailored suit, immaculate. His expression flickered between surprise and familiarity. "Grace." "Min." They shook hands, no hug, no sentiment, not yet. Inside his office, framed certificates lined the walls. UC Berkeley Law. A black and white photo of him and her late husband, David Lynn, smiling in front of a courthouse bench, both younger and invincible. That was a lifetime ago, when trust was still a currency they believed in. Grace took a seat and pulled out a thick manila envelope from her leather bag. Min raised a brow. "I want to initiate full asset protection," she said. He didn't ask why, just opened the folder. She spoke clearly without embellishment. "My son's wedding. I financed most of it. The venue, the vendors. Everything passed through my accounts tied to contracts with my name. But I wasn't invited. I wasn't even acknowledged. I was erased." Min's pen paused over the first contract. "Jesus." Grace shook her head. "Don't. This isn't about pity. It's about leverage." Min leaned back, reading. "Solstice Villa. Yes. The estate is partially under my name for the day of the wedding. Temporary co-ownership. I reviewed the clause with my estate planner. Clause 6.2. Min muttered, flipping pages. Usage rights, limited liability, mutual consent for operational activity. Grace, this makes you legally able to shut the venue down." Her voice was soft but precise. "That's why I'm here." Min nodded once. His expression changed, less friend, more attorney. "We start by freezing all financial disbursements tied to your signature. Move liquid assets into an irrevocable trust. No one touches it but you. No heirs, no proxies. Not even with power of attorney." He typed swiftly, the clack of keys filling the room like a quiet march. "You still have the originals of these contracts." "All of them." "Good. We'll back everything up, digital and physical. Create a document trail that's impossible to challenge." Grace's eyes didn't waver. "I don't want revenge," Nomin said. "You want accountability?" She nodded. "And insulation from the consequences they never thought would fall on them." Min paused his typing. "We can escalate this to include a formal dispute of venue usage. As a named co-owner for the day, you have legal standing to halt event operations pending review." "Would it hold?" He looked up at her. "They used your money. They used your name. And they erased you. This would hold in front of a judge, a camera crew, or God." Grace allowed herself a thin smile. "I don't want chaos," she said. "Just silence, the kind they forced on me, but louder." Min picked up the phone. "I'll have my paralegal draft the initial warning." He dialed. "Also, we're blind copying the guest list." Grace didn't blink. "I want them to know the illusion is breaking, that everything they celebrated is standing on a platform I built." Min's paralegal entered 5 minutes later with a printed draft. The email was brief, formal, devastating. Subject: operational review notice. Temporary usage rights enforcement. From Legal Counsel of Grace Lynn to Solstice Villa, BCC, all Lynn Tran wedding guests. This is to inform all relevant parties that due to active contractual disputes regarding temporary ownership and financial clearance, the operational use of Solstice Villa for the Lynn Tran event is now under formal legal review. Per Clause 6.2 of the venue agreement, Ms. Grace Lynn, co-signer and temporary co-owner, has exercised her right to initiate an immediate halt on continued services until financial and legal inconsistencies are resolved. Min looked at her. "Once I send this, you can't take it back." "I don't plan to," she said. He hit send, and the mask began to tear. Back at Solstice Villa, the celebration was at its crescendo. Guests wandered the terrace beneath string lights, drinks in hand, laughter echoing into the dark coastal air. The DJ had just transitioned into the second playlist, slow, sensual, curated by Avery's college friend who knew vibes. Inside the floral tent, however, the mood cracked. One of the caterers pulled her phone from her apron pocket and froze. She nudged the pastry chef. "You seeing this?" On the screen, the operational notice. Word spread like wildfire. Two servers whispered by the bar. A lighting tech halted mid-adjustment. A groomsman frowned at his phone and quietly stepped outside to call his wife. Inside the bridal suite, Avery stood in front of the mirror reapplying her lipstick. Her cousin burst through the door, phone shaking in her hand. "Have you seen this?" Avery took the phone. Reed stopped breathing. "Ethan," she screamed. He appeared a second later, loosening his collar, half-tipsy glass of bourbon in hand. "What?" She threw the phone at him. "You said your mom signed everything." "She did." "She did not," Avery shouted. "She just sent a legal notice to everyone at this wedding saying she's pulling her rights from the venue." Ethan scanned the screen, then turned pale. "Oh my God," he muttered. Avery's voice sharpened. "This is humiliating. My parents are going to lose their minds. The guests are reading this right now. The managers have already stopped serving the dessert bar." Ethan reached for his phone. Dialed. Grace answered on the second ring. "Mom," her voice quiet, steady. "Hello, Ethan. What did you do?" "What I was legally entitled to. You sent a cease operations notice to my wedding. I sent a reminder that you don't get to erase me while standing on the foundation I paid for. You're blowing this out of proportion." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You removed me from the guest list, but kept my name on every payment. You made a choice, Ethan. I'm simply making mine." He was silent. The music at the villa shifted slightly lower now, uncertain. A violinist whispered to the event manager near the back of the stage. "Mom," Ethan said, desperate, "this is public. People are watching." "Yes," she replied, "and now they'll see the whole picture." Back in her apartment, Grace stood at the window watching dusk fall over San Francisco like a slow curtain. On her desk sat two folders, one labeled Asset Reallocation, the other Trust Conversion, Grace Lynn. A cup of tea cooled beside them. No celebration, no regret, only the steady breath of a woman who had finally learned. Being quiet doesn't mean being small, and silk when layered over steel cuts just the same. The rain had started sometime after 3, not a storm, just a quiet, persistent drizzle that painted the sidewalks in silver and tapped against windows like a hesitant knock. Grace Lynn stood at her kitchen counter, steeping oolong leaves in a ceramic pot she'd owned since her wedding day. The scent was warm, earthy, grounding. She didn't flinch when the doorbell rang. She had known he would come eventually. She wiped her hands on a linen cloth, crossed the room, and opened the door. There he was, Ethan, soaked to the bone in his expensive suit hair matted to his forehead, eyes red like he hadn't slept. He wasn't wearing a coat. He hadn't come prepared. His posture was that of a man who'd run out of stories. "Hi, Mom." Grace held the door without speaking. He took that as a yes. When he stepped inside, the scent of tea and lavender wrapped around him like a fog. He hadn't been here in months, maybe longer, and yet everything looked exactly the same. The lace curtains, the antique lamp, the wooden table with worn edges where he'd done homework 25 years ago. Grace said nothing. She turned and walked into the kitchen. Ethan followed. She gestured for him to sit, and he did, slowly, like his body didn't know what to do without instructions. His eyes flicked around the room, avoiding hers. She poured the tea, set a cup in front of him. Silence. It filled the space like a fog machine, settling into corners, hanging between spoons and shadows and unspoken apologies. "Thank you," he said softly. She sat across from him, hands folded, waiting. He took a sip, then set the cup down with a quiet clink. He stared at the table. "I came to talk." She nodded. More silence. He blinked hard. Then the words cracked. "Please," he whispered. "Can we stop all this?" His voice shook. His shoulders collapsed inward. He looked smaller than she remembered. Younger somehow. "I know you're hurt. I know what happened was wrong. I know, Avery, that I should have said something, done something. But please, can we end this? The vendors are panicking. Her parents are threatening lawsuits. My job might be in jeopardy. This is all getting out of hand." She watched him and said nothing. He looked up at her then, truly looked at her. "Mom, I'm begging you, don't do this. Don't keep making it worse." Grace's voice, when it finally arrived, was calm, even. "I didn't make it worse, Ethan." He flinched like she'd slapped him. "I didn't uninvite anyone. I didn't pretend someone didn't exist. I didn't look through my own mother like she was a problem to be solved. I didn't do any of that." His mouth opened, closed. She leaned forward. "I was left outside. Not by mistake. Not because of a logistical error. I was left outside because someone decided I no longer belonged. Mom, you stood there, she continued, voice never rising. You saw it happen, and you said nothing. He dropped his head into his hands. I didn't think it would go this far. No, she said, you thought I'd stay quiet. He looked up at her, eyes glassy. I was trying to keep the peace. Her mouth curved barely. The peace. I thought maybe it was better this way. Just for the day. Avery was already stressed. She didn't want tension. She didn't want me, Grace corrected. And you agreed. Ethan's voice cracked. It wasn't about not wanting you, it was complicated. She let the words sit there, then folded her hands again. Complicated is when someone forgets your dietary restrictions at Thanksgiving. Complicated is when two cousins argue over politics. This wasn't complicated, Ethan. It was calculated. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his suit jacket, rain mixing with something else now. Tears. I didn't know how to stop it. You didn't try. He shook his head. I froze. I didn't want to make a scene. You made a statement, she said quietly. And you made it with silence. He looked shattered. Completely. And for a brief moment her chest tightened, not from sympathy, but from recognition. This was the boy she'd raised. The one who cried when he scraped his knee. The one who couldn't sleep after watching sad movies. The one who used to bring her Mother's Day cards made of construction paper and dried pasta. That boy was gone, and this man, this version, was trying to climb back into her arms like nothing had burned. You didn't just leave me out of a party, she said. Her voice softened now, almost tender. You left me out of your life. He didn't respond. The rain tapped gently against the window. Grace stood and walked to the sideboard. She retrieved a napkin, handed it to him. He took it, but the space between them had already widened again. She sat down, folded her hands. What do you want, Ethan? He blinked. I want to fix this. You can't. I want to try. She looked at him long and hard. Why? He hesitated. Because you're my mom. Her eyes didn't waver. And he swallowed. Because I miss you. She leaned back slightly, the chair creaking beneath her. You miss my presence or you miss my contributions. He didn't answer. And in that moment, the silence was louder than anything either of them could have said. She rose again, walked to the small stack of folders on her desk, and placed a hand over them. I've protected you for years, Ethan. Protected your dreams, your loans, your home, your wedding. I did it without question because I believed that love was loyalty, that blood meant something. She turned to face him. But love without respect isn't loyalty. It's leverage. Ethan stood too now, trembling. I'm sorry. I know. I'll talk to Avery. I'll fix this. I don't need you to fix it. He stepped closer. Then what do you need? Grace looked him in the eye, deep and steady. I needed you to choose me, she said. And that was the only sentence that mattered. Because he hadn't, and they both knew it. He stood there in her kitchen, his heart breaking too late, while she for the first time in years felt whole and unmovable. He walked to the door without another word, opened it, paused. The rain was still falling. Mom, he whispered. Yes. His voice was barely audible. Do you still love me? Grace didn't hesitate. Always. But then she added almost gently, loving you doesn't mean I'll let you use me again. He nodded once, then walked out into the rain. Grace closed the door, locked it, turned, and returned to the warmth of her tea. The first lawsuit landed on a Monday. It came wrapped in white paper, stamped and sealed, delivered not to Ethan or Avery, but to Diane Tran's gated residence in the Oakland Hills. Avery's mother answered the door herself, still wearing her weekend silk robe, not expecting the courier, not prepared for the phrase, breach of contract, floral and design services, printed in bold across the top of the envelope. She read the first 3 pages before calling her husband. He skimmed the documents in silence, then turned to her with eyes that no longer sparkled with entitlement. What did she say about paying everything up front? He asked quietly. Avery, downstairs on the couch, still scrolling through curated wedding photos she hadn't yet posted, heard her mother's voice rise through the floorboards. Do you understand what this means for the firm? 2 days later, another lawsuit arrived. This one came from the venue itself. Solstice Villa versus Lynn Tran, citing property damages, unauthorized occupancy, and disruption of vendor services. The number at the bottom of the filing made Avery's father go silent. The silence lasted a full 3 minutes. On Wednesday, the DJ filed a complaint for breach of payment. On Thursday, the boutique bakery followed suit, claiming non-payment on a custom cake valued at $400-600. By Friday, the imported orchid shipment had been confiscated by customs after failure to pay holding and clearance fees. The flowers were destroyed. Grace received a courtesy notice from the logistics company. She made no reply. She didn't need to. By the end of the week, Ethan's phone buzzed with less frequency, not because people weren't reaching out, but because most of them had stopped trying altogether. The congratulatory texts had dried up. The LinkedIn messages slowed. A planned onboarding meeting at his new firm was quietly canceled. No explanation, just silence. He emailed to confirm. He got one line in return. "We're reassessing priorities internally. We'll be in touch." They wouldn't be, because in the background among executive circles where gossip walked in through polished mahogany doors before press releases did the rumors had begun to swirl. He used his mother's money without her consent. He built a wedding on false pretenses. He misrepresented liquidity. He didn't even invite the woman who paid for it. It was the kind of story that stuck, not because it was tragic, because it was humiliating. At the country club, Diane Tran's weekly lunches turned quiet. Fewer women smiled when she entered the dining room. No one asked about the honeymoon anymore. Someone even left a clipping of an anonymous op-ed in her locker when lavish celebrations hide ethical rot. She didn't show up the next week. Avery, meanwhile, found herself blocked from a bridal collaboration group on Instagram. Brand reps who once offered discounts now ignored her DMs. She posted a photo of her bouquet with a poetic caption. It got 12 likes, 8 of them from cousins. She started turning off comments. She started turning off her phone. And Ethan, he simply stopped trying. One afternoon, he wandered into the guest room and opened the wedding binder. There were no receipts, no contracts, no checklists, because Grace had taken them all. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. He finally understood what it felt like to lose something you didn't know was holding your whole world up. And Grace was gone. Not missing, not hiding, just absent. She didn't call. She didn't send messages. She didn't respond. She simply moved on. A week later, on a foggy Sunday morning, Grace Lynn stepped off the bus near the Monterey coast. The air smelled like brine and wind and old eucalyptus. She wore a dark gray coat, soft leather gloves, and her favorite scarf, the one David gave her their last Christmas together. A single suitcase rolled quietly behind her. She walked 4 blocks until she reached the town square, where small cafes and art galleries sat like sleepy neighbors. Just off the corner, nestled between a consignment bookstore and a vintage record shop, was a narrow storefront with frosted windows and a faded for-lease sign. The old florist's shop, closed since the pandemic. Empty for over a year. The paint on the awning chipped, but the iron lettering above the door still read, "Wild Petal." Grace paused on the sidewalk. The windows were dusty. She cupped her hands against the glass, leaned forward and looked in. Bare floors, empty shelves, a sun-faded counter, a single glass vase left behind sitting on the sill like an orphan waiting to be claimed. She exhaled, not with sadness, with recognition. A small smile tugged at her lips, one that didn't ask for permission. Behind her, a gull screeched overhead. Across the street, a man opened his cafe and waved absently at her. She nodded back, then stood still for a moment longer. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself not as the woman left off a guest list, not as the mother whose name had been erased, but as the woman who had rebuilt something in silence, who had chosen herself after decades of being chosen last. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded flyer. Lease opportunity, zoned for retail, flexible terms, and ran her thumb across the agent's name. She didn't call. Not yet. She turned from the window and looked down the street where the coast opened wide and wild beyond the town square. The fog had begun to lift. Grace stood there still as a mountain as the illusion of who she had been finally crumbled behind her. Not with fire, not with fury, but with dignity. Because when a wall falls, the loudest sound isn't always the collapse. Sometimes it's the silence that comes after and what you choose to build in its place. The shop smelled like eucalyptus and fresh earth. Its walls were soft white, dappled in early morning sun that filtered through wide bay windows. Shelves lined with small terracotta pots hugged one side of the room. The other bore reclaimed wood crates stacked with bundles of baby's breath wild roses and lavender wrapped in twine. A little brass bell jingled as the front door opened. Grace Lynn glanced up from her work table, hands gently binding stems into a bouquet. A breeze swept in from the ocean, carrying with it the scent of salt and possibility. Outside, the sea exhaled slowly against the shore. The sign above the door was modest, but hand-painted with Kerdu's flowers. Her Vietnamese name, her legacy softened now into something warmer. The name no longer whispered from the mouths of ungrateful children or the backs of wedding brochures. It was hers again. Her apron was stained with pollen. Her hands were covered in soil, and she had never looked more at home. In front of her, on a small ceramic shelf above the register, sat a photograph in a sun-warmed wooden frame. A boy no older than 6 smiled with watermelon juice on his chin and a daisy crown crooked on his head. Ethan before the world asked him to choose between appearances and love. She didn't look at the photo often, but she didn't hide it either. It was part of the bouquet now. A little girl's voice called from behind the counter. "Miss Dew, can I tie this one?" Grace turned. Behind her, 8-year-old Amaya stood holding a mess of tulip string dangling from her wrist. Grace smiled. "Bring it here, sweetheart. Let's do it together." Amaya ran over, dragging her jacket along the floor. Another pair of sneakers pounded across the entryway. "Could you?" a boy named Eli shouted. I swept the front step. "Did you now?" Grace said, eyes twinkling. "That calls for extra gummy bears." A glass jar on the counter labeled Bouquet Bravery Jar held candy instead of tips. The children of the neighborhood had claimed it as their own currency for flower-related chores. She gave Eli a wink and handed him 2. Every morning since the shop opened, they came kids from the surrounding cottages and bungalows. Their mothers brought them in with coffee, let them help for half an hour before school. They carried vases, watered stems, held scissors like surgeons under Grace's guidance. She had not planned it. But then again, nothing beautiful in her life had ever arrived through planning alone. Grace returned to the bouquet on the table. It was for a young woman who had just lost her grandmother's sunflowers and irises, tied with a gray silk ribbon. As she placed the finishing touches, a soft knock tapped at the back entrance. Mail delivery. Grace wiped her hands and opened the door. A tall woman in a navy coat handed her an envelope. "From the Bay Foundation," she said, "came with a personal note." Grace thanked her, set the envelope on the counter, and continued her work. It wasn't until the shop was quiet again, the children gone to school, the floor swept clean, that she sat down and opened the letter. It was printed on thick linen paper. "Dear Ms. Grace Lynn, we are honored to confirm receipt of your endowment to the Bay Vocational Trust. As per your designation, the Dew Scholarship Fund will now provide annual tuition to 5 young women pursuing floral design, sustainable gardening, or creative entrepreneurship. Your legacy will not only bloom in petals, but in lives changed. With gratitude, the Bay Foundation." Grace sat back in her chair, her eyes tracing the soft curve of her name at the bottom of the page. She folded the letter, placed it in her drawer, and closed it slowly. It wasn't pride she felt, it was relief. For so long her hands had built things for other people, weddings, homes, careers, dreams, that belonged to everyone but her. Now they were building something that would last beyond betrayal. Outside, a mother walked past with a stroller. A couple stopped to admire the window display bouquets of daffodils and thistles arranged beside a sign that read, "Healing takes root, so do we." One of the teenagers from the cafe next door peeked in to wave. Grace waved back. The bell above the door rang again. A young woman entered, damp from the morning mist, with nervous hands and hesitant eyes. "Hi, I heard you're hiring part-time." Grace tilted her head. "You like flowers?" "I do. I don't have much experience, though." Grace smiled softly. "That's all right," she said. "You can learn." The girl relaxed. "Really?" Grace nodded. "Come back tomorrow. We open at 8. As the girl left, Grace turned back to the table and began assembling another bouquet, this one full of soft greens, muted pinks, and baby blue forget-me-nots. No purpose yet, no recipient, just instinct, just peace. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the hum of the sea and the rustle of leaves, Grace felt it. She had come home, not to the city, not to her son, to herself. To the woman who had always been quietly strong, quietly generous, quietly waiting for her name to matter again, not on paper, not on contracts, not on checks, not but on the front of a shop where every bloom carried her story. And now finally it was hers to tell. The knock was softer this time. No urgency, no force behind it, just the tentative rhythm of someone who no longer expected the door to open. Grace paused by the window, the steam from her teacup curling up toward the sea-drenched morning light. She already knew it was Ethan. She waited. Outside, the coastal wind whistled low, rustling the lavender stalks along the fence. The bell above the flower shop swayed gently, not from customers today, but from the breeze. Another knock just as light. Grace opened the door. Ethan stood there, his suit wrinkled, his hair messier than she'd ever seen it. There were no grand gestures this time, no bouquet, no over-rehearsed apology. Just him, hollow-eyed, bare-handed, lost. "Mom." His voice caught in his throat. She studied him in silence, and then with quiet grace stepped aside. "Come in. The tea's still warm." He entered like someone crossing into unfamiliar land, 1 foot at a time, unsure if he belonged. She led him to the small table in the sunlit corner. He sat. She poured. Chamomile with a touch of honey. The silence stretched long and gentle between them. Ethan cupped the mug but didn't drink. "I've lost everything," he said. Grace nodded, neither cruel nor indulgent. "I know. My job. Her family disowned us. Avery left this morning." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I thought I could fix it. I didn't know how deep it would all fall." Grace met his gaze fully, now calm, steady, unshaken. "You didn't fall," she said. "You built the scaffolding yourself. You just never thought it would collapse." He blinked. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I really didn't." "I believe that," she said. "But it doesn't mean you didn't." His lips parted, but no words followed. Grace folded her hands on the table. "Tell me something, Ethan. Do you truly understand what you did?" He looked away. Not just the embarrassment, not the money, not even the contract you never read. She leaned forward slightly, voice gentle but unwavering. "Do you understand what it meant standing outside your wedding, listening to a stranger tell me I didn't belong?" He flinched. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You erased me, Ethan, from the most important day of your life. From your life." Tears welled up in his eyes, and he opened his mouth again, still no words. "But," Grace continued, softer now, "I'm your mother, and I forgive you." He looked up quickly, hope flaring. "But I won't return what you've tried to take." Confusion flickered across his face. "I forgive you," she said again, "but I won't give you access. Not to my accounts, not to my decisions, not to my peace." He swallowed hard. "This isn't revenge," she added. "It's boundary. And for the first time in my life, I won't apologize for having one." A seagull cried in the distance, sharp and sudden. Ethan leaned back, eyes hollow. "I don't even know who I am without the life we had." Grace looked at him, her son, her greatest ache, and said simply, "Then it's time you find out." He didn't respond. She stood, walked to a shelf, pulled down a small paper bag. Inside was a jar of dried lavender, a booklet titled Simple Florals for Solitude, and a small ribbon-bound envelope. "This is not a handout," she said, placing it in front of him. "It's a seed. Use it however you want." He nodded wordlessly. She watched him rise slower, now heavier. At the door he turned. "Do you hate me?" he asked, voice barely audible. Grace stepped into the doorway with him. "No," she said, "but I don't carry you the same way anymore." Then she closed the door quietly, not with finality, but with decision. Later that afternoon, the garden bloomed like a song. The wind had shifted from sharp to soft, and children's laughter floated down the alleyways like ribbons. A small wooden table had been set in the backyard behind the shop. It was covered in mismatched linens, chipped porcelain teacups, and flowers. Oh, the flowers. Magnolias for dignity, peonies for healing, snapdragons for strength. The children from the neighborhood had helped set it all up. Amaya wore a crown of baby's breath. Eli held a balloon shaped like a teapot. They called it Ms. Dieu's tea party. There were no speeches, no cameras, no posts to document the occasion, just neighbors' laughter and sunlight through glass jars of lemonade. Grace moved among them like she belonged, because this time she did. No longer the backstage figure arranging centerpieces for someone else's celebration. No longer a ghost in the room where she'd paid the bills but been denied a chair. Here in this garden on the edge of the sea, she was the guest of honor. Someone had made a tiny paper banner to Ms. Dieu, our flower queen. Grace laughed softly when she saw it. The children handed her a bouquet not store-bought, but built by small, imperfect hands, stems uneven, ribbon crooked. She clutched it to her chest like a crown. In the distance, the sun began to set, casting long amber streaks over the water. The tide rolled in quietly, peacefully. As the children played, Grace slipped away for a moment to the edge of the garden. The view stretched wide sky, sea silence. She stood there barefoot in the grass, wind pulling at her hair, eyes steady on the horizon. Behind her, voices rose in laughter. She closed her eyes and breathed. This was her party. No orchestra, no seating chart, no velvet ropes or photographers. Just the wild things growing, the sea always coming back, and her centered, rooted, finally seen. She had thrown a banquet for her own becoming, and she had shown up, entire, untouchable. The celebration didn't need music to matter, because Grace Lynn, once erased, once overlooked, had become the centerpiece of her own story, and no one would ever write her out again.